This is the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Try and dress like I was in the coin-op industry, and I wore sort of an open-throated shirt with, two buttons undone at the top and kind of an old wide lapel jacket and sort of jeans, trying to look kind of sort of hip, slick, and cool, and went down to Los Angeles, and they sent me to a major coin-operated games retail outlet to see if I could buy one of the Asteroids copies that was coming from Japan.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I like interviewing the lawyers. They always know what's really going on. David Burling was in-house counsel for Atari from 1980 through 1984. His job included distribution contracts, licensing, and manufacturing. He supervised the customs department, intellectual property, and international business transactions. His stint included being general counsel of the international division and counsel for the AtariTel telecommunications products. This interview took place on May 22, 2015.
I'm just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place called Lamy. Lamy. After the Archbishop, death comes to the Archbishop. I don't know if you're familiar with the Willa Cather book, but he was a major figure in Santa Fe history and built the first cathedral in Santa Fe and had a big land grant that was given to him by the Spanish monarch or whatever at that point, and we live at the end of off Willa Cather Lane on Bishop Lamy Road.
Huh. Awesome.
Overlooking 5 different mountain ranges, which is kind of fun.
It sounds beautiful.
It is. It's 7,000 feet, and we're having a very wet and green spring, which is very unusual for us.
Very nice. Cool. So I would like to talk about your time as corporate counsel for Atari. So how did you get started at Atari? How did you get that job?
The general counsel of Atari, Skip Paul, I had met when he was at Stanford. He had graduated from Stanford College and was the resident associate at the Stanford in Britain campus, which was a place called Cliveden, which is where the Astors lived and where Rule Britannia was sung for the first time in a little amphitheater on a hill. And he was actually serving his alternative conscientious objector status. I mean, some guys were changing bedpans in Vietnam. He ended up living in this cushy palace there, and we got to be very good friends. He was there for 3 months. I was there for 6 months, and he had to go back. And we kept in touch regularly after that, and I went on to law school, and he went on to law school, and he got the job as general counsel at Atari, and within about a year, he realized it was way too much work because the company was growing so fast, and he needed somebody inside to help him, and lured me with a great job offer from my practice in Washington, D.C. for a small boutique administrative law firm.
Cool.
So I moved from Georgetown back, and the idea of going back to the Bay Area was a goal of mine all along, because I loved that whole area after being at Stanford for 4 years.
Sure. Nice. All right. So, when you got there? I mean, what was the situation? What were you dropped into?
I was dropped into just about everything that he couldn't really handle, and that included at that point.
This is 1980, right?
This was 1980. Yeah, this was May of 1980.
Okay.
And so it included at that point a little bit of everything. I mean, I worked on I worked with the facilities guys on real estate leases, for example, because we kept having to, rent new buildings around the area. There were all kinds of trademark and copyright issues in terms of, reviewing advertising and packaging and manuals to make sure that the use of the trademark was proper and that we weren't violating anybody else's trademarks or anybody else's copyrights, and that we weren't, taking images from other people that we hadn't paid or gotten the rights from. There was, negotiating agreements with distributors or sales representatives. In the United States, we had a system of sales representatives that worked with our sales guys to make the calls on the big accounts and the small accounts. Eventually, the big accounts were brought directly inside and stuff like that, and we had our own sales team. But when I first got there, the United States was divided up into several districts, and we had sales reps primarily responsible for that, and they all had to have contracts and a percentage of their sales, et cetera, things like that. International was just getting off the ground. I had to work on a variety of international sales, distributorship agreements, authorizing those people and sort of setting forth the terms of their dealings with Atari and what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do and what they would pay and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. One of the most challenging initially was we had several huge accounts like Sears and Kmart and J.C. Penney, mm-hmm. Toys R Us, who'd ordered so many cartridges from the VCS division that they would have special agreements, and we had to be very careful because they were ordering so many, hundred thousands of cartridges. They, of course, wanted a better deal than the rest of the guys got, but there's antitrust laws that deal with pricing discrimination and things like that, so we had to be careful about that and negotiating the contracts with them to make sure we avoided that. Often put me into a very precarious position because here I am dealing with this company that accounts for, a substantial part of the Atari business at that point as the VCS division, as the consumer division was growing, to make sure that we didn't, I remember getting called on the floor once for I was brought in surprisingly to a Kmart negotiation and explaining why I'd put certain provisions in the agreement, and the guy was not happy with them and kind of roasted me a bit there, and I sort of tried to stand up to him, and I was pretty quickly ejected from the room.
Do you feel like the Atari management generally tried to keep things on the up and up legally, or were you trying to wiggle around?
Yes.
Right.
Well, yes. I would have to say one of the great things about working at Atari was the relationships I was able to build with so many of the different people in so many different divisions, and it was exciting for me getting exposed to so many different things because my prior practice, I'd worked on the Court of Appeals doing, researching decisions and helping my judge draft opinions, and then I was working on international trade matters and energy matters and some food and drug matters and things like that, but I was rarely involved in the actual workings of a company. I was sort of at a distance. But to get to know the people in advertising and packaging and the engineers and the marketing staff and the operations staff and people and manufacturing was all fascinating. And my job was to try and build up a close enough relationship so that they would bring me in early so that I wouldn't be put in situations like that, so that we could all work out things that would work out best for the company. And one of the things that lawyers are often criticized for is being kind of no people, saying, no, you can't do that. Right. And I quickly learned that I needed to be able to say, no, you can't do it that way, but let's look at other ways you might be able to accomplish the same thing and try and come up with creative solutions that would work for them. So that was that was a large part of my work as well, besides, just actually doing the legal stuff, was trying to build those relationships and so make sure that I was called in early enough that I could help prevent anything from happening untoward. I never saw any intention to do anything criminal or against the rules in any way. Right. But some people just didn't know. Sure. Easy to accidentally break a rule or something. Yeah. And actually, that was good because I was able actually to build up. Occasionally, I was able to have seminars with, for example, the international distributors or some people in our department about the proper use of trademarks and copyrights and what to look for and what to avoid, and explain some of the nuances there as they develop things to make sure that they didn't infringe other people's rights accidentally, unintentionally. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of misinformation floating about in the world. Sure. So it was I was working with my boss on coin. I'd have to go work on coin-op matters, or for example, one of the things that happened early on was before I'd gotten there was a handheld game. I can't remember what it's called. Was it Breakout? Was there like an individual handheld game, Breakout, or something like that?
There might have been.
We sold way too many of, and then they sort of started returning them because they couldn't sell them.
I remember there was a handheld like Simon sort of game called.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, that was it. Yeah, and that caused problems. So I had to go work with the credit department a lot on what they could negotiate, what they couldn't negotiate, and how they could get into it or out of it, or deal with some of those kinds of disputes. Coin-op, I think you maybe the way you got my name was by my posting on that site about the Asteroids game. One of my very first jobs there was to try and dress like I was in the coin-op industry as I interpreted that and as I was told by those guys, And I wore sort of an open-throated shirt with, 2 buttons undone at the top and kind of an old wide lapel jacket and sort of jeans, trying to look kind of sort of hip, slick, and cool, but also kind of I don't know what. And went down to Los Angeles, and they sent me to a major coin-operated games retail or distributorship outlet to see if I could buy one of the Asteroids copies that was coming from Japan. And I met with the head guy there and had a story about how my brother-in-law was going to open up a route, coin-op route back in Virginia, and he needed some machines, and I heard that this guy had some great distributors, stuff. And the guy was really nice. I don't know if he caught on to me right away or what, but he said, well, your brother-in-law would be much better buying it from somewhere back in the East Coast, not here in Los Angeles, and there was no way I could get him to sell me one of these games. So that was unsuccessful. But I then had an appointment with these Japanese guys in a tower in Century City, and I went there for my appointment, and they were more than willing to sell me a Asteroids coin-op game right away and put together the invoice, and I had the bill sent, and the Asteroids game was shipped to me and went to my office, and it was a Japanese copy, and that was the basis of a copyright lawsuit we brought against them and took to the Customs Department to try and prevent the importation of unauthorized copyright infringing Asteroids games. It was on free play in my office, which was kind of fun for a while.
the copy game?
Yeah, the copy game, yeah. So I was a popular guy. Lots of people would sort of drop in and say, oh, I heard you had one of these. Now, the thing is, I was in the headquarters at that point was 1265 Borregas Avenue in Sunnyvale, and downstairs we had this giant games room, which you probably heard about, which had a sample of almost everything we'd ever made, including the Hercules pinball machine and Space Race or whatever it's called, all kinds of things. And we could go down there, and those were all on free play anytime we wanted to, but having one in my office was a little bit less obvious and fun for a while.
Nice. You got to do some sneaky undercover work. That's cool.
So that was really about the only one I did there. I mean, I would also go to all the trade shows for the different divisions initially with my boss, and he would primarily be there to help negotiate deals in the back room at our booth, and I would troll the floors looking for any kind of possible infringements that we might see or possible technology that might be useful. The engineers mostly did the technology kind of scouting, but seeing about things like that. So that was kind of fun, although walked my shoes off a few times.
Do you remember seeing any infringements out in that situation?
I picked up some flyers from a couple of places, and we followed up with them and sent them letters. I didn't actually see actual copies on the floor of things, but they were talking about that they had these kinds of things, and so I don't remember if we actually tried to buy anything or not, or just sent them letters saying, cease and desist. I sent a lot of cease and desist letters to lots of people in all kinds of industries for use of our names or claiming to have some kind of rights to various of our games or names. Another sort of fun thing along that, I mean, a lot of my work was in intellectual property initially and just business contracts, and part of that, as I said earlier, was reviewing all the advertising that went out to make sure we were properly using our trademark and not using other people's incorrectly, because sometimes we licensed, like Space Invaders, the trademark, and had to have an acknowledgement that it was actually owned by
Taito or whatever.
Taito, yeah, I think it was Taito. Things like that, and also make sure there was no claims that were unsubstantiatable, and all that kind of stuff. And oh God, I was leading this. This was leading up to something, and I've just totally forgotten where it was. But anyway, one of the funny things, actually, I remember in reviewing packaging with the coin-op people and their advertisements and tear sheets that they would send out, was that one of the artists, the graphic artist there, was using the images of various employees. Some of the engineers and various people in the coin-op field were being put in there to the missile command, operating the missile command panel or whatever, and things like that.
Right.
So did
you need like a model license at that point, or did you?
Well, I think I'm trying to remember whether we actually had to get a separate license or not. Obviously, if we had anybody outside the company, we did. But inside the company, the general form that they might have signed in confidentiality stuff may have included a release of use of their names, but it never got into any trouble on that one. But that is something we had to be careful of as well.
So this podcast, this is all fascinating, and I'm going to use every bit of it. But this podcast focuses on the Atari 8-bit computers.
Okay.
So do you have any stories or memories regarding to anything you had to deal with, specifically with the computer side of things?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so when I first got there in 1980, I guess the computer division was just really pretty much starting. I mean, the big thing was obviously the consumer division, and I guess trying to think when the PC division, the computer division, split off from the consumer division, because initially they were all part of the same group, and then they split off.
And they split. I don't know when that happened.
Yeah, it was pretty soon after I got there, and that's when my boss hired another lawyer from Washington, D.C. that he'd known who'd helped us on a lot of FCC work, named Jamie Cook, to come in and be the general counsel, or the counsel, not general counsel, but the vice president counsel for the computer division. Mm-hmm. And I got appointed to be vice president and counsel for the consumer division. Mm. There was not yet any international division, and my boss continued to, CoinOp was probably bigger than the computer division at that point, but my boss kept the CoinOp division primarily for himself. And there was no international division as such yet. It was an ancillary to the consumer division or the computer division, but at that point there was practically nothing on the computer side internationally. So my exposure there was more limited. I worked with some of those people before that was a split, and sometimes there were overlapping issues in terms of use of names or copyrights and things like that. And we were certainly all at the same. I mean, when we go to a show, the computer division as well as the consumer division were all represented in the same booths and the same hotel suites and party rooms and things like that. So I certainly remember many of those players well. I guess before Jamie came in, I mean, I think I remember, working on, there were some CompuServe kind of agreements, and there were various kinds of negotiations with other companies that had software that we were trying to get licensed to be able to use on the Atari computer. Mm-hmm. And I remember working with some of those guys on those issues.
Can you think of any licenses that you tried to acquire or that didn't work out? I mean, we something. There could have been a I don't know, Mork and Mindy game or something. I'm trying to think for that time.
CompuServe is the only one that comes to mind right now. I guess there were some operating system issues that we dealt a little bit, I want to say, with Microsoft and Nintendo. I mean, there were some negotiations back and forth on some of these things, and I don't think they were ever concluded. It was funny about the whole Nintendo, how that went up. But again, that was probably more consumer division. It's harder for me to break out the computer side of what was going on there. Certainly whenever we brought copyright lawsuits, almost every game that we made for the video game, the VCS, was also be brought in for the computer side. Mm-hmm. And we had a lot of imitators, and particularly, I mean, the biggest one was, of course, the Pac-Man, the Casey Munchkin case, which again was primarily a video game, but we had Space Invaders for the computer as well.
Sure.
And that was a lawsuit we started bringing in a variety of different jurisdictions, and that was one of our greatest successes. But by that time, we'd actually then brought in, because Atari was growing so darn fast, we then brought in a full-time intellectual property lawyer named Ken Nussbacher, and he became the primary go-to person for the actual day-to-day litigation issues that required the documents and training the outside lawyers on how to best protect us by taking what was the then copyright law and trying to apply it to software. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how familiar you were with the copyright laws at that time and how that applied, but basically it was trying to protect books and films and images. Mm-hmm. But there was nothing specifically for video games, and so we basically used a parallel, an analogy to movies, mm-hmm. because these are moving images, and the issue there was that the copyright code would be completely different, so you couldn't claim copyright infringement based on the code, because that could be written all kinds of ways to still achieve the same results, but it was more on the actual visual imagery. And even though each game player might play it differently and the images would change as they played it, there would still be, sufficient similarity between the images of our original ownership in a copyrighted game that could be applied to theirs as well. And there would actually be demonstrations in court to the judges. There were never any juries involved. To the judges, showing K.C. Munchkin on a screen, and then showing Space Invaders on a screen, now I'm thinking Pac-Man. I'm like, K.C. Munchkin was the Pac-Man,
right? Yeah.
And just showing all the similarities of the blinking, and the maze and all those kinds of things. And I think the very first place we beat them might have been Hong Kong. And I think the second place we beat them was actually in Holland. This is NV Philips, a Dutch company, being beaten in their home base, and injunctions were issued to prevent them from further distribution or use of those games. And we did it in a couple of other countries as well. I'm not sure where at this point, but enough to sort of beat them back substantially, and actually lead to some fairly major developments in the whole software copyright law based on visual images as opposed to actual code.
Interesting. Did you know Nicholas Lefevre, an attorney there?
That's a name I've heard, and was he at Atari?
He was at Atari. Yeah, he was in-house counsel at Atari.
He came after I left. I left.
He moved over with Jack Trammell. So.
When Jack Trammell came, he offered me a job, and I was wary of him. There was, based on certain things I'd heard about his possible reputation and the like. And I was in pretty bad shape at the moment anyway. And actually, so I said no. And I was being offered a 6-month severance package from Atari, and that was a pretty good deal, and some other perks as part of that departure package. So I decided that would be my better way. And what I ended up doing is I went into at Warner Communications, very fortunate and good expense. They covered my rehab. I went to a rehab in San Francisco and for 30 days and started my recovery.
Wow, that was nice of them.
It was very nice. Yes, I mean it's part of the package is you get your insurance coverage for a certain period of time and stuff like that. So it wasn't something we had negotiated, but they were very. I was very fortunate.
Okay. Well, since you brought it up, are you willing to say on the record about how Atari culture might have contributed to your need for rehab?
Well, I can certainly say yes. I mean, God, I'm getting my memory from having been to Woodstock and Altamont and all the rest of things, and sort of majored in rock concerts in San Francisco when I was at Stanford and minored in Frisbee at the beach. My mind is a little hazy on exactly what would have been the motto, but it was something like Atari, our motto is fun, or something like that. And that was certainly the case. As I say, there were some negotiations where some people were indulging in certain kinds of substances, and it was common to see that certainly at parties or off-campus events, and there was even some seeing of it around on campus during the day and things like that. So I would say certainly it was an atmosphere conducive to enjoying life to its fullest, naturally or with some additional fuel.
What else haven't we talked about that we should about?
Okay, let me. I actually put together a little bit of a list. Okay, so I'm sorry I don't have more specifically on the PC side of things, but among the things that we did from a licensing perspective is we sometimes would license technologies, and I remember we actually we're negotiating with Stanford University. They had some encryption technology that we were interested in, and we spent some time negotiating for that. I'm not sure we finally ever concluded that deal because we sort of moved on quickly, and then things sort of fell apart. But Warner Communications was our parent, as you well know, and of course there were a lot of divisions there that had various names or content that we would like, and vice versa. And they had a whole licensing division at Warner Communications, and among those licensing was sort of the DC comics and things like that, and I remember when we did a deal for licensing the Battle Zone and I think a couple of other trademarks for use on ladies and men's pajamas. I mean, I thought, wow, who's going to put Battlezone on their pajamas? But anyway.
Well, there's a while you could find Pac-Man on everything.
Right.
It was on sheets and, bed sheets and drapes and whatever. So,
yes.
I could see them
so
trying
there were things like that. On the copyright side, we actually were able to use that copyright thing to go around Paris and some other parts in France, and actually, the police would then put chains across some of these bars that had some of the illegal games until the games were removed. Another licensing opportunity we had at one point, again, this started off on the VCS side, but probably would have extended. Anytime we entered into a license we could, we'd always talk to Computer Vision and see whether they wanted those rights as well, because licenses were had to be fairly well sliced and diced into such a way that would have not only royalties, but what field of use would they be? Would it be just, the VCS, or would it include computers, and would it include coin-op or whatever? Was flying up to Tahoe for the afternoon with a guy from the marketing side of Atari to meet with Minnesota Fats and talk about a Minnesota Fats pinball game. And we actually met him, and he was playing around on the tables there, and we spent a couple of hours talking about various things, and we ended up not doing that. I can't remember exactly why it fell through, but that was sort of a fun opportunity. We also did a trip to New York to get the rights for Othello, and I can't remember what the name of the company was that had those rights at that time, but so those were other kinds of things that went on regularly. As we grew, the international division was separated. I became the general counsel of the international division, which encompassed both computers and home video games. And another guy was brought in to be the vice president and counsel for the consumer division, consumer electronics division. And we also brought in a couple of other lawyers. One was sort of a general kind of corporate lawyer that did a variety of things. We brought in a bunch of paralegals to help with a variety of things. We brought in two patent lawyers eventually, and the international meetings were fabulous. They were held all over the world. One of my favorites was at Zermatt, Switzerland, and we actually had Pac-Man and Blinky and all the rest of those characters dressed in costume skiing down the slopes at Zermatt, and we had paid for the train that takes you from the village of Zermatt up to the slopes, and on that they would be serving wine coolers. They were playing music. The train cars were decorated. One night we all got into horse-drawn sleighs with heavy blankets over us and taken up into the hills of Zermatt to a lodge where we had I can't remember what the name of the smoked meat is, and gherkin, traditional Swiss dish up on the top of the mountains, and then going back down again, we were all invited to participate in a kind of a luge race down to the bottom, and I ended up with my partner going over the edge and landing in 6-foot snow, and it took us like 20 minutes to go 10 feet to get back onto the main drag.
Sounds like Atari was just hemorrhaging money.
It was pretty appalling, and at the very end, they were planning on building a helicopter landing pad right next to the headquarters for the chairman. That was certainly anyway the rumor. I didn't see the contract for that, but because he lived in the city, and a number of people lived in the city, and when I first got there, actually I was told that there would be a headquarters in San Francisco, and that's why I originally rented a place in San Francisco, and that unfortunately fell apart. But yes, money was thrown at a lot of things. In excitement, and also just to try and catch up with the amount of work that was coming on. The people were hired at such a rapid pace. I don't know what extent of interviews, or even more so than interviews, we may have hired very qualified people, but how much training they got had to be a major issue because of the fast growth and how many things had to be done so often.
Right.
So a lot of people had a lot of autonomy, and I'm not sure how much control was being exercised over a lot of that. Not that we didn't have a lot of super capable, very smart, very fun people to work with. I mean, it was an exciting time, and I don't think I've ever had any. I know I've never had any experience like that since, even though I got to be general counsel at Banana Republic and working with the Gap and a variety of other places, which was pretty fun, but it was not anywhere near the same level of energy and excitement. So that gives you a little bit of the international side. International side, again, we were doing all these distributorships with, Saudi Arabia and South Africa, and I visited a few of them, and we had a big copyright lawsuit in Australia that I had to go down to for at one point. And I was sent over to Japan one time to negotiate the license with the Japanese for a couple of the games, coin up. So it was a very exciting life. I got a lot of, and it was all first-class travel, at least in the beginning, for the first, up until probably late 83, early 84. And then I eventually got moved over to become vice president and counsel for AtariTel, which was initially called the Falcon Project as a sort of code name because they didn't want the public to know that we were working on a telecommunications device. And that was a lot of fun, working with a small group out of L.A. that were developing various devices. There was everything from, we had actually bought the rights from AT&T for a video camera over the telephone. We had a guy, a very famous designer named Morrison Cousins, design a telephone module for us, which I've still got a sample of, which is very cool. We were hoping to have totally, kind of Skype over the telephone lines. Telephone lines were kind of limiting, but that was one of the places we were heading. We were trying to develop a device where you could actually, like the French.
Are you thinking of Minitel?
Minitel, yes, like the French, and one of our chief engineer sort of scientist guys was working on a way that we could print, make airline reservations and print our tickets over the telephone. There'll be a little printer built in.
That'll never happen.
So anyway, there was a lot of excitement there, but unfortunately that cost a lot of money in startup expenses, and as Atari hemorrhaged elsewhere, there was no longer extra money to be distributed. So AtariTel got closed down first, and then I went back over into, basically, I guess I got a call sometime in July of 1984, all of a sudden to get ready to head to New York with the rest of the lawyers to negotiate the sale or help with the already being negotiated sale of Atari to Jack Tramiel. And I was put in charge of calling all the Atari overseas sales offices, which was France and Taiwan, Hong Kong, about what their current sales were. I was trying to basically get an accounting of basically an inventory of what they had in terms of sales and expenses and things, so that when we negotiated with Jack Tramiel, we would know more or less what kind of debts he would have to assume, if any, and what kind of debts we would have to absorb if we were unable to get him to accept those, and what kind of potential sales potential or assets we might have. And I was supposed to do that on a purely confidential basis. Now you can imagine a phone call to France when I'm the German guy and I'm saying, I need to know all this stuff, and they're saying, why? You've never needed this before. What's going on?
Nothing.
Pretty untenable. Sorry, I can't talk about that.
So at the end, you were kind of putting the nail in your own coffin as far as your Atari employee.
Yes. And we all got moved to, I can remember going to, I don't remember what the name of the building where the International Division and the Consumer Electronics Division were housed. I'd moved back over to which was originally the coin-op building when I did the AtariTel, and then I went back to the other building towards the end. And I think I was the only only office lighted on the second floor for a while, and then they moved me down to the first floor to try and consolidate things. And then shortly after that, they moved us down to a building down where Coin-Op had moved, which was down near San Jose, the name of which escapes me at the moment too, but it was Milpitas, I guess it was. And all of us lawyers were sort of put in one section there as we tried to wind down everything and make sure all the assets were properly transferred and that we'd accounted for them all and help in that regard.
That sounds like that might have been just like an impossible mess with such a big company with so many assets and buildings and international. I mean, that seems like, what do we have here? It seems like it would be very difficult.
It was very difficult, and I was not in great shape, so I'm not sure how much of a help I was for them. I mean, some people negotiated, 2 or 3 times their regular salary in order to stay, because most people were jumping ship or getting severance packages or going and saw what was going on and going off and getting other jobs. And so for Warner Communications to keep them on the payroll, they'd have to pay them extra.
Yeah.
And they kept a small enough team that I guess it all basically transferred reasonably well thereafter. But I don't know.
Yeah.
I left in, I think it was the end of August of '84 is when I ended my particular stay there, and a couple of the others stayed on a little bit longer to help wind things down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very depressing side to see all these people suddenly gone. There was a lot of tears.
I bet. If you could send a message to the Atari community that still exists, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
I loved working at Atari. People were great. The times were fun, and I miss them all.
Yeah.
I understand there actually have been a couple of reunions. Unfortunately, I got to one many years ago, but they continue to happen occasionally, and unfortunately, because I'm now here, I'm not quite on the same circuit anymore, but I have a couple of friends from the Atari days I keep up in pretty close touch with, and I've asked them to make sure I know the next time something like that occurs, because I'd love to see them again.
Nice. What haven't I asked you that I should have?
There were all kinds of other parts of Atari that we haven't really sort of talked about, but they're not significant. There was an Atari store, and you could get discounts on buying various merchandise. And one of my great things as being the lawyer that approved all that stuff is I'd often get samples from the woman who ran the store, because keeping me on her side and I guess reviewing things quickly for her was a benefit to her. So I got those, and a lot of people got special merchandise like free Atari things or games or computers and the like, and I unfortunately never had enough time. Whenever I decided I'd go in to learn how to use the Atari computer on the weekend, I had such a pile of inbox work that I would always work on that rather than learning how to use the computer. So I never learned to use the computer until after I left Atari and I was working for a law firm and had to start helping doing that kind of stuff. So
wow. So you had to approve every thing that was sold at the Atari company store?
Well, if it were something other than the regular merchandise, I mean, they would make mugs or they would make, various things with the logo on it. Any time the logo was used, we had to basically make sure that it was being used properly and stuff like that.
The logo is so weird with the angles. Did you have situations where you're just like, this logo is not proper?
No, the biggest issue really was a lot of times people would just put the Japanese Atari symbol by itself or put it to the side instead of over the top of Atari, and that was our primary trademark was the symbol on top of the name Atari. Mm-hmm. And that was the proper usage, and it wasn't supposed to be used other ways because that diluted its strength and made it less protectable and defensible and enforceable against other people and stuff like that. And that was difficult sometimes because it was hard to fit them together. So they'd often put them side by side, or sometimes they used the symbol by itself, and that really wasn't much help. And so those were the primary issues.
Interesting.
So they always seem to get those curved lines again with the center, the straight line done pretty well.
All right, cool. All right, I think that's about all I have, unless.
Okay, I can't really think of anything else. I'm sure other things will pop up from time to time, but I think that's the thrust of it as best I can recall.
Well, this is great. Thank you so very much.
Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.